Good evening. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful spring evening. It's nice to be able to say those words, beautiful spring evening, all in one sentence after the crazy weather we've been having. I'm Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Carey Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Friday Night at Carey. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go through my usual routine, those of you who have been here. Number one, you'll see some people have tags on the back of their seats. Those tags are reserved seats for our elderly Able Society members. You're all friends of the Carey Institute, that's why you're here. But in that range of friends who make donations, we have a category above $500 that makes you an elderly Able Society member. And one of the privileges is to reserve a seat for our lectures, which is often a good thing. So please consider joining the Elderly Able Society if you enjoy our lectures. I'd also like to talk about upcoming events here. So first, on Friday night lectures, there's something that is cursed about Friday the 13th and about this year. So in all the years we've done this, we've never had to postpone or cancel a lecture. In February, because of weather, Dr. Margaret Palmer could not get out of Baltimore and get back to Baltimore, so we had to postpone that lecture. And unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond his control, Bruce Lurie, who's going to come talk to us about toxins in the environment. Bruce has written two wonderful books, Slow Death by Rubber Duck, which is my favorite title, and Toxin, Tox Out. And Bruce, we will try and get him here in the fall, but we are rescheduling something else for that date. Stay tuned. But I did feel Friday the 13th was inauspicious. We then, on June 24th, have a very special lecture. It is our Ned Ames lecture. Ned helped found the Carey Institute. And this year, our founding president, Gene Likens, will be talking and giving the Ned Ames lecture, which has a certain snapshot wonderfulness to it. Gene will be talking about 50 years of work at the Hubbard Brook Research Forest in New Hampshire. And the title will be Lessons from the Forest. A little sooner than that, we're going to have another forest theme. Sort of forest is the theme for the spring in many ways. Another forest theme event. On Saturday, May 7th, we're going to have one of our science and management forums in collaboration with the Oblong Conservancy and the Duchess Land Conservancy on the future of oak forests. We're particularly focusing on the management of oak forests on private lands, and particularly conserved private lands. So please consider coming to that. Tomorrow, if you happen to have time in your schedule at 10 a.m., Vicki Kelly, who runs our monitoring programs, is going to be giving a walk through the Fern Glen, which is a beautiful area just sort of down below here. We have 3 spots available, so if you're interested, let me know after the lecture. Finally, for kids, grandkids, godkids, any kids you know, we run a wonderful summer camp, week-long sessions, and we have some spots left both in the summer ecology camp for grades 2 to 7 and in the arts and science camp, particularly for high school students. We're going to be getting the word out, but I thought I'd get the word out to you guys first. All right, I think that's it for our events. It is a pleasure to introduce John Waldman. John is a distinguished ecologist, but also a tenured professor at Queens College at the City University of New York. John did his PhD in a wonderful program that was also with the City of New York, but jointly in evolutionary biology with the American Museum of Natural History, an organization that certainly has over 140-year history in the city. In some ways, his career came circle from his PhD back to CUNY. But he spent 20 years, which is a long run for any institution, at the Hudson River Foundation for Science and Environmental Research, mostly known as the Hudson River Foundation, to his friends just HRF. And his time at HRF, he had a number of positions, but he left as their senior scientist and then went back to academia. I served on the kindred spirit. I spent 18 years as well at the Conservation Society and come back to science at the Carey Institute. So I understand completely the sort of multiple careers in science. John writes beautifully. I will tell you first about his most recent book, which we're going to hear about today, Running Silver, which I recently read. And it is beautifully designed and a pleasure to read, and that is not something one can say about every science book. His first book, maybe not his first book, the last book I know of, has the best title, again, a book on marine and estuarine life called Heartbeats in the Muck. History, Sea Life, and Environment of New York Harbor. Both these books will be available afterwards. Merritt Bookstore has kindly brought some of them. John will sign them for us. John also received in 2002 the New York Conservation Leader Award from my former institute, Wildlife Conservation Society, my former institution, sorry. When I was speaking to colleagues at WCS about John, they all agreed that he was one of the people they most enjoyed collaborating with. As he said, he plays nicely in the sandbox. But I think that's part of why, for several decades now, he's been a real thought leader on the recovery of fisheries in our rivers, and particularly the Hudson River. So it is, given our passion for the Hudson River at the Carey Institute, a real pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Josh. Does it sound okay? Yeah. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I've had about a 30-year relationship with the Carey Institute and was impressed with the quality of the research and the quality of the people. So I'm happy to just here in the stage and telling you about my passion, which is restoring rivers and restoring fish runs. I'm going to warn you that I'm going to depress you. This is mostly a lot of bad news. I'll end with some helpful notes and some ideas for the future. But it's not a pretty picture, and I'll tell you why. Let's start off with this image that I used for the title slide. This is an image of shad being landed at Robin's Reef, which is a reef in upper New York Bay. You can see it from Manhattan. And from the 1800s, and back in those days, there were shad fisheries on the Hudson from that site all the way up to about Albany, every half mile or so. And vast numbers of shad were taken. The highest catch was about 4 million pounds around 1890. In 2015, not a single shad was landed legally in the Hudson. We went from 4 million pounds to 0. And that's kind of setting the tone for much of the rest of what I will tell you. So a bit about these fish. These are diagenous fish. I'm going to throw a few terms at you. So here's diagening 101, the freshwater sea fishes. First of all, this is an uncommon kind of life history. There are about 30,000 species of fish on the planet, and less than 1% are diagenous. It's also an evolutionary convergence. It's not like one group of fish that suddenly became diagenous. It spread across species as primitive as lamprey and as advanced as striped bass. It has two categories. One is anadromy, where fish are moving regularly between freshwater and saltwater, but they spawn in freshwater, like salmon, sturgeon, and shad, go to sea, put on weight and grow, and come back again to rivers to spawn. And that's the great majority of our diagenous fish. The alternative is catadromy, which are, in the case of this region, it only includes eels, like this giant bronze river eel we caught last year. These are fish that are spawned at sea and migrate to fresh water to grow up and return to sea to spawn. So this is the Atlantic assemblage, and we are blessed with many of these species in comparison to other parts of the world. In fact, the Hudson has almost all of these. It lacks Atlantic salmon and doesn't have spawning hickory shad, and it may have had anadromous brook trout years ago, but everything else is found here. And I circled these species because I think they're key. These are in the herring family, blueback herring and alewife, and these are two fish that migrate into smaller systems. And I think we're doing a pretty good job these days in resurrecting these runs. There's a lot more to be done, especially in New York and Hudson Valley, where we're lagging way behind other states. But there's hope now. There's progress being seen. The key to unlocking rivers in general is to get the shad back up. This is a big ocean-going fish that likes to go way up rivers. And if we solve the shad problem, we solve everything else, because everything else follows. Okay, why did the fish cross the road? To spawn. This is a Alaska salmon. It's a chum salmon, I believe. It's a pretty famous image. And it shows what I call the migratory imperative, the drive to get up to the spawning locations. And in fact, I've been to Alaska a couple of times, and I've seen the salmon coming out of the ocean up the rivers. And I remember one time I was by a a road where there was a culvert under the road. On the other side, there was a rocky hill at 45 degrees with water trickling down it. And pink salmon were going through the culvert and dashing their way like drunken mountain climbers up this rocky slope to lay their eggs. So this power to migrate, this drive is just incredible in these fish. And the same thing happens here in the Hudson and the Connecticut River and other rivers too. The thing is that these are big murky estuaries where you just can't see it. But at this moment, this is April 15th, right now there are sturgeon and shad and stripers coming up the river, not in original numbers, but still in respectable numbers in some cases. And they're doing this, but you just can't see it. One of my favorite examples of this migratory imperative it stems back to, I think, back in 2006. I was in Iran for a sturgeon conference, and I was in a sturgeon hatchery on the banks of the Caspian Sea, and I was looking at this poster of the fishes of the Caspian Sea, and I noticed that there was a European eel on it. And the European eel is spawned in the Sargasso Sea. It's kind of where the Bermuda Triangle is. And the Caspian Sea, as you know, is 100 feet below sea level. It's a landlocked sea, and it has no natural connections to the external world. So I was wondering, how is this eel there? It doesn't make any sense. So I started asking questions, and what I learned was that, in fact, there are European eels, which are spawned in the same area as the American eel here, that then wrap around the Gulf Stream for roughly a year or so, and then pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. As they start out as these little glass eels. They're tiny little larvae that are transparent. They transform to these small versions of adult eels, these elvers. They swim through the entire Mediterranean. They go through the Straits of Bosporus and Istanbul. They go into the Black Sea. They go through the Straits of Kerch. They go into the Sea of Azov. They pass through a canal, enter the Volga River, and then go to the Caspian. I did a quick sort of Google map exercise. It's about 4,000 miles. Just to spread out. They're not going there to spawn. They're just spreading their distribution. Hopefully they'll come back to the Sargasso at this point. So what are the costs and benefits of this unique life cycle? You know, it's rare, but when it works really well. There were some populations that were extraordinarily successful and huge in the old days. The benefits are, here are our theoretical understandings of these. One is that there's a relative mortality difference between habitats. If you want to lay eggs somewhere, you're better off having your eggs hatched in a relatively sterile freshwater tributary way up in the mountains than in the sea, which is full of hungry mouths. It's just a much safer place to leave it in. Also, once the larvae hatch and become juveniles, they can sort of drift down into the estuaries, which are at the mouths of these systems, which are really rich feeding grounds for them to put on weight before they enter the scary ocean. So you have differences in mortality, and you have differences in food resources. From the fish's point of view, the ocean is an inexhaustible resource. The river has a finite amount of food in it. The ocean is essentially endless amount of food. But there are costs to this. One is the physiological adjustments that are necessary. It's not easy to go from pure freshwater to pure seawater and vice versa. Freshwater is 0 parts per thousand, so seawater is about 35 parts per thousand. You take a freshwater fish and put it in salt water or vice versa, it almost always dies. These fish can make that osmotic adjustment. Migrations, which can be very lengthy, have energetics costs. It takes energy to make those long migrations. There's also predation risks because if they're traveling long distances, they're exposing themselves. But the interesting cost to me is the fact that they're risking the suitability of two habitats. Their life cycle won't be completed unless they maintain that circular life cycle in these two locations. And if one of them goes kaput, they are in trouble. And these historical advantages of taking advantage of these two different kinds of habitats, freshwater and saltwater, have now become, as a friend put it, contemporary curses. So I'd like to show this image because it's a Hudson image and because it shows three anadromous species: sturgeon, shad, and a striped bass. This is from 1886. It's a lithograph from Lossing's work, and it shows a fishing camp in those days with the big cotton nets being dried because in those days cotton rotted if you didn't dry it. And it says a lot about the fact that the three species shown are all migratory anadromous fish. They're not showing a yellow perch and a white catfish and a sucker. These are the fish that harvest the riches of the sea and deliver them to fisheries and rivers. I'll talk a bit more about that. Another question that often comes up when people talk about anadromous fish is why home? Why not just go anywhere? And some work that I did has shown that in fact sea lampreys don't home. But other fish do home to roughly the 99% degree, give or take a little. And the reason we think this occurs is because there's a certainty of habitat suitability. If a fish is in the ocean and it's at the mouth of a river, it doesn't know if that river is suitable for its reproduction. But if it returns to the same place where it was born, it's already certified. It produced that individual. So it makes sense to come back to a river that produced your own kind. And there's corollaries to that. One is that, or consequences, that allows fine-tuning to the migratory circuit. So for instance, salmon have great variations in rivers they occupy. In a little Nova Scotian river, that might be a state river, that doesn't have much water most years, these fish might come back at a young age and spawn several times, hoping that one of those years is successful. A salmon spawning in a big Norwegian river that might have to migrate 200 miles upstream through major waterfalls might delay its reproduction and grow larger in the ocean and then make one trip and die. So there's a lot of this kind of strong fine-tuning to the particulars of each river, and this has resulted in morphological adjustments. Populations and races is a term that was used in fish biology, where you had noticeable visible differences among different subgroups within rivers. So for instance, on the case of the Hudson, there's records of the commercial fishermen who were really acute observers of what they were fishing for. I mean, they were out with the fish every day. Noticing that they had shad they called yellowbacks, bluebacks, greenbacks, goldens, pinks, pink-faced, locust, chunker, and chunkheads. Now, I don't know how many of those were real subpopulations, but there were differences there that are now lost. Not only do you not see these differences, you don't even see shad anymore, but back in those days we had these many variations. In the case of the Potomac River, the fishermen noticed a May shad which had a thicker tail and a somewhat different body form. A really great example are Atlantic salmon. The Restigouche Indians are so intimately connected to their salmon that they can look at a fish and tell you which river it came from. So, in researching the book, I was very interested in really getting a good handle on how abundant these fish were in the old days. And we don't have survey records, but we have our anecdotal accounts by people who came from Europe, colonists who recorded what they saw. And you have to remember they were coming from a continent that had been overfished and overlumbered and just overused environmentally already in the 1600s for many centuries. So they were not used to the kinds of pristine abundances that they saw here. So I have many quotes that I collected, and some may seem embellished, but I think there's a reality to this. Just what comes across is there were vast numbers of these fish. So for instance, here's three, one from 1634. They spawn in such multitudes, it is almost incredible. And from 1616, at such abundance as is incredible. And this is my all-time favorite from 1728. He says, this is William Byrd, Natural History of Virginia, in a word, it is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, it's also incomprehensible what quantity is found there. One must behold oneself. I would say this guy was impressed. Those days are over. This is a image that shows an interesting postcard that I found that I think tells a story. It actually is a sort of visual metaphor for what's going on in rivers these days. I was in an antique shop and I just said, wow, what a story here. This is a little river in Cape Cod called the Herring River. And in fact, in Cape Cod, every river is either called the Herring River or the Mill River, which kind of gives you the dichotomy between the two uses of rivers. Either you respected the fish and called it a herring river, or you used it for mill power and called it the Mill River. But what this image shows is the potential and the vulnerability of these fish runs. So this is a river that's been sort of manicured to become a sort of a easily fished river. These creeks are small, and it leads, this creek leads to a little seining pond where there's then access to the spawning pond. And it's been set up for fishing. You have barrels here, you have a little beach to land your seine, and you can seine your fish, put them in the barrels, and take them straight to the market. The beauty of this is that, based on past history, you know that somewhere, let's say around March 20th every year, these fish will show up. Maybe the 18th one year, maybe the 25th another year, but they're going to come to you. If you wanted to get those same barrels of fish in December or August, you would have to search the entire ocean and you wouldn't find a single individual. but they come right to you. This is the beauty of this. And their lives are in your hands. So if you're smart, you can sustain this fishery. In fact, I researched that this fishery produced 3,700 barrels of alewives a year from this little creek for a long time. But if you allow enough of those individuals to get past the seines and the nets and up into the lake, this can go on forever. But if you block that run, you will murder this fishery. We have too much control. And this is what happens on our big rivers on a big scale. So what's happened to these fish over time? I gave you those quotes about the incredible abundances. Well, this is the state of the same species today, America's shad river herring. This is just the crash from 1950 to the recent period. And in fact, state by state, Massachusetts, total closure since 2005, Rhode Island since 2006, Connecticut near total closure since 2002, New York reduced in Hudson, closed elsewhere. So we went from incredible abundance that was beyond belief to you can't even catch a fish anymore, take it legally. One of the interesting sort of narrators of this development as it was happening was Henry David Thoreau, who was more famous for writing a book about a pond, but he also wrote about rivers. He wrote a wonderful book called The Leak on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which is not his most famous work. The trip was made in 1839. It was published, self-published in 1849. He made the trip with his brother. It actually took 2 weeks. And as he paddled the Merrimack River at a time when it was just being industrialized, he was an incredibly perceptive person. He saw doom for these fish. And every chapter or two, he has a paragraph or two about what was going to happen to these fish. And he was really, truly, deeply saddened. And in fact, he had many wonderful quotes. I'll show you a few later on. But this one really got to me, this plaintive statement, who hears the fishes when they cry? And the rest of the country was excited about these mills being built and the great progress that we were going to have. And he saw the opposite. He saw what was going to happen to these rivers and how they were basically doomed. So what happened to that location? This is the Anaskietic Mills on the Merrimack where Thoreau paddled. And Anaskietic is a Native American name for a waterfall that was called Bait Fishing Place. It was a passable falls where the fish aggregated and they could be speared or netted. This is what became of that river. It was completely industrialized. This is downtown Manchester area. Just endless amounts of factories and water being used for various purposes. And what's left of it today? Well, Anaskietic Mills was above the first two dams, and then there's a third dam now at the Anaskietic Falls, which is where they have this Anaskietic Fishways Visitor Center. And you can go to this visitor center and be told that you're going to celebrate the magic of the Merrimack. And when you go there, you are supposedly going to be looking at fish passing up this fish ladder, and you're talking now about lamprey, shad, salmon, and river herring, and then watch them pass through this viewing window as they go upstream. So the public is going to go look at the viewing window here and see these fish. On most years, they don't get a single anadromous fish going past that window. So there's no magic here. And in fact, the only fish they see is this fiberglass shad when they enter the parking lot. It's really pretty sad. So in researching the history of this, I've done a lot of work with my colleague Carl Lindbergh, who's worked with a lot of people here, Carrie, a wonderful ecologist. And we looked at a lot of different metrics of these fish. And size is one that's interesting because there's qualitative evidence that there's changes over time. There's not a lot of good quantitative data. The best data I found was actually John McPhee's wonderful book, Pounding Fish, about the history of shad, where he said that in the 1840s in the Susquehanna, shad tacked 40 to the barrel, and in the 1860s, 100 to the same size barrel. And it's just been small shad since then. Sturgeon used to get very large. If you haven't been to the Hyde Park Post Office over here on the Hudson, you've just seen this mural up close, which is wonderful. It's a very large sturgeon being landed in front of the Hyde Park landing. And back in the old days, Atlantic sturgeon they approached 800 pounds at 12 feet. No one's seen any fish like that for a very long time. These are some large sturgeon from Georgia. I just hope to see them again someday, but it'll be a while. There were better metrics that we followed. We looked at species and population persistence. And we looked at 22 species that were found either in Europe alone, North America alone, or both. And about half of them had insufficient data because they weren't commercially important, not being commercially important, there's no funding for them. But for the ones that were studied well, we found that all of them lost populations. American shad have lost about half their populations, and about a third of the North American Atlantic salmon population have been extirpated. So there's a depressing metric. But the most powerful analysis was looking at abundance over time. We looked at the abundances of the American species, and here you see Northeast Atlantic, the European species. And it's okay, we standardize them all to one. And we standardize it to the highest abundance for each that we found. In some cases we have species-wide, in some cases we have particular populations. But what do you see here? You see in almost every case a line like this. And the one exception is striped bass, which is a species that crashed in the Chesapeake, which we brought back again. So looking at these declines, there's two possibilities here. One is that they're all simultaneously declining to zero, and we're going to kiss them goodbye soon. The other is that something kicks in where they don't quite get to zero. And I think there are some aspects to their life history, in particular the fact that they can aggregate in space and time. So small populations can find each other by reducing their spawning period from 3 months to 2 weeks, and to one location and still maintain themselves, which is bad in one respect in that you lose your genetic variation. But the good news is you still have fish to work with. So looking at this broadly, we found that of these 31 time series, there was a 98% decline from historic highs in 13 and 90% in an additional 11. So these were shocking. I mean, we expected bad news, but these were shockingly bad numbers. So following the abundance story a little further, Atlantic salmon are a great case history. It's estimated that there were somewhere on the order of 300,000 to 500,000 in U.S. waters alone when the colonists first came here. I have a friend at the Atlantic Salmon Federation who said 500,000 is low. He thinks it's higher. In 2014, there were less than 400. And in some of these rivers, you're literally looking at 2, 3, 4 fish. So they are in danger of being extirpated. But the story that most resonated with me was the Susquehanna River shad story. You know, every species has a particular river that is really like its showcase river. And for shad, it was the Susquehanna. It was just ideally suited to shad. It's a very fast-flowing, shallow river that goes deep into the heartland. In fact, the Susquehanna goes from the head of the Chesapeake Bay all the way to Lake Otsego in upstate New York. And shad used to run this far, 500 miles. And they would run into the West Branch, too. And it was such a big part of local the food supply and the culture that there would be people who would come in, vendors who would come into villages and yell shadow and blow a horn, and housewives would come out and buy their shad for the week. And it fed a large part of the Susquehanna Valley. It also supported these traditional shad bakes that were done, and also done in the Hudson Valley too, until recently, to celebrate the arrival of spring with the shad. And these are some shad being landed back in those good old days. And in those days, some of the observations were just hard to fathom today. There was one fishery in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where it's called the Webb fishery, where someone would sit on a hill with a spyglass and wait for the shad to be visible in the water from a quarter mile away. He would see the water bulge and waves start to break on the shore as a school of shad came up. And a really amazing story was at the mouth of the river, there was a fishery called the Stump Farm Fishery, which was a huge fishery and had a very long net. And they set it one day, this was at Havre de Grace, they set it one day and a fierce north wind came, and for 4 days it sat out there blocking the fish. And they couldn't retrieve against the wind. And then when the wind subsided, it was so full of fish, it took them 3.5 days to land it. But when they landed it, it took a couple of days to unload it. And they estimated there were 15 million shad and river herring in that one hole. Now compare that to today. Since then, we have 4 dams in a row in the lower 50 miles of the Susquehanna. And in fact, the fish bump their heads against the Conewago Dam only 10 miles from the bay. The restoration target for these, and these I should say, these dams are all retrofitted with fish elevators and fish ladders, which I'll talk about shortly. But the goal is not ambitious. Only 750,000 to get past the 4th dam and make it to some of the historical spawning grounds. We think there were tens of millions of fish in the system in the old days. So it's a very unambitious goal. Just to give you an example, in 2014, 10,000 made it past the 1st dam, 2,500 past the 2nd, 1,300 past the 3rd, 8 fish made it past the 4th. That was better than the year before when 0 made it. And in a good year, they get 100 making it back to their historical reporting grounds. And this system is just, it's so sad what's happened to it. 3 of the dams are now filled with sediment and can no longer contain any sediment. This is a system that delivers 95 pounds of sediment to the bay every second. It's a heavily sedimented system. So these dams are no longer functioning even as reservoirs. They're just basically dams holding back sediment, which is giving more time. It has consequences for the nutrient loading of Chesapeake Bay, and it's a disaster, basically. So, in focusing on this broad subject, what really resonated with me was the idea that, unlike the Pacific coast, where a lot of salmon runs were lost very recently, and there's a sense of urgency in bringing them back, there's no urgency here, because we lost these runs so long ago that we're used to not having them. And this fits into this notion of the shifting baseline syndrome, which you may have heard of. This was a concept proposed in a sort of innocuous one-page paper from Daniel Pauly in 1995, but it's just bounced around the conservation world in a big way. And Pauly said each generation of fishery scientists accepts as a baseline the stock size that occurred at the beginning of their careers and uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks are further declined, but it is the stocks of that time that serve as a new baseline. So you can have essentially a ratchet effect. The managers come in, they want to hold the line what they have, it slips a little, the next generation of managers comes in. Before you know it, you're not thinking about what was there originally, you're looking at a whole different level that you're trying to maintain, and there's no sense of urgency or even desire sometimes to go back to that original level. So we settle for less and less and less because of the shifting baseline syndrome. And this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted to help inspire people to care more. So here's a good example of shifting baselines. This is shad landings on the East Coast from 1887 to about 2000. And what you see is a typical, huge decline over time, from 8 million kilograms down to, not much more than 0. And you think, wow, we really got a bad job here. But look at 1887 now, going further back in time compared to 1814. Phenomenal decline. This is why it's so important to use historical ecology to get reference points of what was there originally. Because we're kidding ourselves when we think about surveys that started in the 1960s as if it's really reflective of what might have been there 2 or 3 centuries earlier. So what can be done about this? I kind of categorize the solutions this way. We have some that are largely rectified, and in this case, it's pollution. There are some that are tractable and mostly applied, overfishing and power plants. We have some that are essentially untractable and cannot be really pushed back against. That's non-native species and climate. And then we have some that are tractable but unrectified. So pollution, I say it's largely rectified because the Clean Water Act really was a sort of magical cure for a lot of systems. There's still great residues of pollution. The Hudson has its PCBs. But overall, when the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972, a lot of urban systems in particular turned around and became healthy enough to support decent fish and populations and other species too. For instance, the Delaware River down around Trenton was so badly polluted and had such low oxygen levels that it had what was called a chemical dam in the spring. The shad would come up and they couldn't pass the dam because there was no oxygen to breathe. That's gone now, and the shad populations are recovering. We've turned off in the Hudson and elsewhere so many cases of industrial contamination. Here's some pig waste coming into a North Carolina river recently. I'm not saying that this is all done and finished, but we've done a pretty good job on that one cure. Then we have overfishing, and this is extremely tractable and easy to apply if you can get buy-in from the fishermen in cooperation. Conceptually, it's really easy. Take fewer fish. And these fish were heavily overfished over time, but because of better management now, in particular the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, forcing states to work together for the common good, we have really cut down on overfishing dramatically when it comes to these fish. Power plants are an interesting case. Power plants were the issue in the Hudson back in the 60s and 70s. We tend to forget how huge an issue this was. We still have power plants that suck in larvae and eggs and pinch larger fish. But long term, we have some protections against that. We have screens that try to save fish from being sucked in. We also have power plants that are going to age out. And over time, instead of having open circulation to the river, we're going to have closed cycle cooling where you just use a little bit of river water, don't kill a lot of fish. So I think power plants will decline in importance over time. Right now, it's estimated that in the Hudson, these power plants probably reduce the striped bass population by about 20%. Well, that's a really vague number. One that really I think is under-respected as a cause are non-native species. Remember, these fish migrating to these rivers, we think, in order to leave their eggs in places where there are not a lot of competitors or predators. But we've introduced so many species that are predators and competitors that these fish now have to compete with species that weren't there when they first evolved, or get eaten by species that weren't there. So, for instance, largemouth bass not native to the Hudson, and they're like vacuum cleaners with mouths. They just suck up anything, and they will hit these young out-migrating shad in big numbers. Snakeheads are now in the Potomac and the Chesapeake in several places. They're a very voracious predator. Flathead catfish are now in the Delaware. Blue catfish from the James River. We have a whole suite of species that are highly voracious that are now eating these out-migrating juveniles as they come out of these systems. And I think this is huge. We also have species that don't necessarily eat these young fish, but they just change the ecology. So a lot of the biomass of fish in the Hudson are carp. They're not native to the river. And of course, this institute has done an incredible job of studying the effects of digger mussels on the river, and they show that they have big changes. They cause big changes to the ecology of the system, and they are actually directly detrimental to species like shad and striped bass. Then we have climate change. We're not changing this anytime soon. This is on the path towards warmth. Here's a case where we have a direct effect in climate change in the Hudson. This is the rainbow scallop. Pretty little fish, you might have eaten it. It's a boreal species, likes cold water. It used to run as far south as the Delaware in 1900. It disappeared from there. It ran into the Hudson main stem until the it ran into the tributaries of the Hudson until the 1970s, and it ran into the main stem until 1998, when the last 4 little juveniles were seen. Since then, it's retreated from Connecticut and it's becoming scarce in Massachusetts. So tell me this isn't climate change. It's just retreating northward. This was a specimen I photographed in the early 80s in the Westway study. It's probably the last photograph of Hudson River smelt. So tomcod are also right behind. They're wobbling. We're going to lose them from the Hudson, I think, within the next 10 years. We're also seeing southern species move up. So climate change is affecting not only the distributions, but the timing of these runs. It's been shown in Maine that salmon and river herring come in 2 weeks earlier to some of these systems. Who knows how that's rippling through the ecology? So, what is trackable but still unrectified? Here's a clue. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Oh, damn. So here's the Conway Dam, which I mentioned earlier. This is the one the shad hit when they come up from Chesapeake Bay, and it's quite an obstacle. And it's an obstacle for everything that wants to swim upriver. Even eels can't make it past here. Eels can get past any dam, pretty much, but they don't make it past this dam. And they actually collect eels and transport them above the dam in order to help save a native freshwater mussel that relies on the eel for its part of its life history. So dams are, to me, the only thing we can actually make a meaningful change with. And they also happen to be, in my mind, the biggest culprit. Here's an analysis Carl Lindbergh did on the effects of dam on shad. These were the original distances that shad traversed each of the major Atlantic rivers back in the 1800s. Karen looked at how far they make it today, and she found that they've lost about 40% of their habitat in East Coast rivers. Here's dams in the Hudson watershed. This was done by Karen's husband, Dan Sweeney, who's a good scientist. And you see the pattern here of increasing dams with time. Early on, it was for mill power. Back in those days, we only had animals and water power to power our needs. So every little tributary received was dammed. And Dennis estimated there are about 800 dams in the Hudson watershed these days. Most of these, I'd say, have no longer serve any purpose. And yet they exist through inertia. It's very hard to take a dam down. It's being done elsewhere in a very rapid way, and we have to get moving in the Hudson. Across the country, there are estimated to be about 75,000 large dams of 6 feet or more, and hundreds of thousands of more smaller dams. And again, so many of them don't really serve any purpose anymore. So, what can you do about dams? Well, one of them is to use what I consider the standard mitigation, which is to use a ladder. So this is a fish ladder. If you haven't seen a fish ladder, this is what a big fish ladder looks like. So the fish are being asked, as they come up to this dam and want to go upstream, to sense a flow coming through this set of baffled structures. These can be made out of metal or concrete or wood, and they have different designs. But basically, you're slowing the water down a steep slope and asking the fish to go into this very unnatural structure and work their way up to get over the dam. And some species, it's hard to build these things. Some of these work well, some don't. But they're very species selective. Salmon tend to use them pretty freely. Shad don't like them at this scale. River herring sometimes use them. A striped bass and a sturgeon wouldn't be caught dead in them. So you have a filter when you have these operating, and a lot of them don't operate very well. I'll tell you about that in a minute. The other option is to take an elevator. And an elevator is a device where the fish are attracted to a flow at the base of the dam, and then they press a button and they go up to the first floor, and they are released into a reservoir, and there's usually a window there where some biologist, their first job in the real world, sits there in the dark for hours counting the fish that come by. And these things, they can work sometimes better than ladders, sometimes not. The third option is interesting: take a truck. You wouldn't think that fish thrive, but this is a fish delivery truck, and it has this I love this name, Operation Fish Run. And with no sense of irony, fish for the future. I mean, fish don't belong in trucks. These are fish that migrate across the open ocean for hundreds of thousands of miles, and then they have to take a truck to get to the side. You know, they should not depend on the internal combustion engine to get to this point ground. Interestingly, sometimes this works better because they get it over with in one shot. They don't have to find the flow to a fish ladder and fight their way up, and then go into a reservoir where there's no signal of current, and then find the current again, and work their way past a couple of dams. It's over in one shot. And ones that depend on these trucks, even though it's a kind of triage, like the worst case, sometimes succeed better. As my friend Steve Gephardt said, the fish are gathered, put into this dark chamber, driven up, released. They look at each other and say, what just happened? Well, we're here, we might as well spawn. But the point is that terms like ladder, elevator, and truck don't connect with fish. They don't make any sense. So we looked at the success of these devices on 3 rivers. This was a paper I published with some colleagues, including Curran, back in 2013, where we took 3 major East Coast rivers, the Merrimack in Massachusetts, that Thoreau studied, the Connecticut, and the Susquehanna. And we looked at the actual success of these ladders. And what we found was that they're not working. This is the thousands of American shad past these dams. The Essex is the first dam, the Pawtucket is the second on the Merrimack, and the numbers are low. For the Connecticut, these dams are spaced out pretty widely, and quite a few fish made it past Holyoke with the first elevators, but they do very poorly past the others. On the Susquehanna, it's just been abysmal. So there's a metric that's telling you that it's not working well. Here's another one. We're looking now at the number of fish passed as percent of target. And in all 3 cases, the targets are not ambitious. They don't resemble the original runs whatsoever, but they're way higher than what they actually get these days. So here's your percentage of meeting these targets that are unambitious. They range from essentially 0 in the Susquehanna to a peak of about 22 in the Merrimack 1 year. So we're not doing well, even though we're not being ambitious. But here's the real, I think, killer analysis, and that's this one, where we look at passage efficiencies. Now we're looking at the numbers of fish that once they're past the first dam, make it to the spawning grounds. So no longer can the hydro operator say, well, you know, it's not us, it's ecological effects at sea, it's overfishing, whatever. Here you have a controlled experiment, because the fish have made it past the first dam, they're in the system already. How many make it past the final dam? Well, in the Merrimack, first to the second dam, you're looking at 20% on a good year. First to last dam, you're looking at 0. For the Connecticut, you're hovering a little above 0 for both. And for the Susquehanna, you have some success in the first dam some years, although it's crashed recently, and you're basically at 0 for getting to the spawning grounds. So this is like an emperor has no clothes type paper. It kind of shook people up and said, this just isn't working. that be? Well, for one thing, I think we have to think more about the question of scale when it comes to rivers and fish ways. If we're stuck having to use fish ways of various kinds, they should not look like this. This is the Rainbow Dam in the Farmington River. This is a tributary of the Connecticut River. This is a steep slope. I went huffing and puffing up the stairs here, and I was tired climbing those steps. For a fish, like a shad, again, a big ocean fish, being asked to squeeze through these little tiny openings up this steep slope. Why do you shad gather below this fishway? Very few actually make it up it. It's so bad that even though Connecticut is not thinking of taking this dam down, you're going to now put a fish elevator on it because the ladder is not working. So I think scale really matters. And what really hit me was when I looked at the Columbia River in Washington. Shad are not native to the West Coast. They were introduced here in the late 1800s. They are flourishing in the Columbia River as they're declining on the east coast of this country. This is a huge system. This is a tremendous river. And in fact, they have a window too. And they see 3 million shad a year on a really good year past that window. And one reason is that they're not being asked to squeeze up, a narrow little gap. They're going up what is essentially a little river here. This is a big fish ladder. And the shad are not made nervous about this, so they go scooting up it. So if you look at actual data for the East Coast versus the West Coast, Columbia, again, is huge. It approaches 300,000 cubic feet per second. And the Bonneville ladder has 2 to 3,000 cubic feet per second. The average East Coast fish ladder has 30 to 50 cubic feet per second. So they're wildly inadequate. However, if you wanted to have ladders like this, you would have to divert a lot of water into them. Our river's not that big. You're talking about, on average, 17,000 in Connecticut, 12,000 in Delaware. Some of our shad rivers are smaller than the Bonneville fish ladder. So I think scale has been ignored, and I think scale can be incredibly important when it comes to this question on the East Coast. But the fundamental question is there enough water for fish and hydropower together on the East Coast? And I think not. So what can be done? Let's look a little more broadly. I'm comparing now a generic healthy river to, I like these engineering diagrams for these rivers in Maine. It looks like railroad tracks. Each of these is a dam for the Androscoggin and the Kennebec. And these are potentially wonderful rivers. I flew over the Kennebec last year, and what potential. And this river has more natural species than any other river on the East Coast. And it has a salmon run that, we don't know how big it was, but probably hundreds of thousands. They get 7 or 8 fish a year now making it up here. So in a healthy river, these fish come in the spring over a long period, sometimes 3 months, and they sort of stage, work their way upriver. In some cases, you may have fish, these races of fish that are subgroups that might come early to lower tributaries. They might come later to the upper tributaries. They'll spawn happily. They have no barriers getting up and down. And most importantly, the ones that make it up there and spawn can come back again in later years with no obstacles. So you get repeat spawning of larger fish that really help sustain a population. In these cases, what you have with these tiny relic runs are very few fish that then have to aggregate in space and time. So instead of being a 3-month run, you might have a 2-week run, and it might be just here at the base of the first dam. Not clear. And if they do make it past several of these, they often have a very hard time getting back. The provisions for the adults to come back again are very poor. So a lot of these rivers try to sustain their runs with one-time spawning. One-time spawning means that these fish are coming back as small individuals without many eggs. So you're squandering the potential of these fish by not having to come back again. They also are faced with this puzzle. They have to figure out the passage of the first dam. They might spend a week or 2 wandering around. Finally, they say, okay, then go for it. They shoot up the fish ladder. They're in the reservoir. There's no current. They got to find the next dam. This one may have a fish elevator. They got to get into that. It may take a while so they figure that out. They go up. By the time they get up to this spawning grounds, it could be weeks after their normal spawning period. And then they're not connected to the ecological reproduction cycle of the river. And then again, they probably don't make it down again. So it's not working. I'd like to make a point in closing that the toolbox is expanding, and there's more things we could do than we need to use it. So in particular, dam removal. And in my book, I have this mantra that every dam should have an existential crisis. What I mean by that is we should have a national scorecard to look at the utility of each dam versus the harm it does, and try to have a more of a concerted effort to really try to take down these this industrial legacy that is only there because it's hard to remove. It's a lot of work to take a dam down. You have all kinds of legal issues, you have contaminant issues, you have people who still want the dam, even though many people will not. The one great case history for the East Coast, which is a great precedent, is the Edwards Dam in the Kennebec River, which John McPhee wrote eloquently about in Pounding Fish. This dam blocked 17 miles of river since 1837, and in 1999, because it produces very little energy, the Federal Energy and Regulation Commission, FERC, agreed to let it come down, which was huge news, because that was it is a very industry-friendly organization. So it was breached in 1999. Right away, all the species started shooting up the river and utilizing 17 miles of river they hadn't experienced in over a century. And they then gained access to a wonderful tributary called the Sebasticook, which is a alewife Shangri-La. And this river, which hasn't seen an alewife in 100 plus years, went to almost 3 million in a few years in this one river. And it became so popular that they started a alewife festival there. That became a big regional affair. And bald eagles started to depend on this run. And they were so amazed with how many eagles they had. One day they flew a helicopter over it, and they flushed out 54 that were feeding on the alewives right there. So it was a fantastic recovery and a great kind of precedent to be followed elsewhere. There's also a new tool that's out there that I promise, and these are nature-like fishways. This is Seymour, Connecticut, not that far from here, on Naugatuck, which is a tributary to the Housatonic. And again, Connecticut's doing some amazing work, and they're opening up the entire Naugatuck. It has a series of dams. They're either taking them down or they have to building a fishway of some type. But here, they couldn't take the dam down because it's supporting it's connected to the basis of Route 8. So instead of building a traditional fish ladder and hoping it might work, they built a nature-like fishway around the edge of it. Nature-like fishway is basically creating a stream that flows around the dam. So here you see the stream flowing past and entering right here, and these things often work very well. In fact, in the Peconic River on Long Island, there's one riverhead that they had a aluminum ladder first that did not work well. Now that they built this, the fish are just scooting up it. And I was there for the inauguration. Hillary was supposed to be there that day. This is big news in Connecticut. She didn't make it, but Senator Blumenthal was there. And also John Bullard, who's the head of Northeastern Division of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And he said he loves this project because it makes fish. And I just love the simplicity of that term, it makes fish. Another great tool that's out there is dam trading. And this was done on the Penobscot River recently. This took tremendous negotiations among the state, federal agencies, and Native American tribes up there. But in the end, the Penobscot, which used to be the best salmon river in the U.S., and had a number of dams blocking that run and was heading towards zero, they ended up having a compromise where they took a lot of the turbines that were on the main stem dams and put them on the tributaries up higher in the watershed, opening up the main stem. So you still have the same amount of electricity being produced, but it's not blocking the main stem anymore. And it's showing immediate promise. We're seeing very strong signs of recovery already. So I'd like to make the case that right now is potentially a transformative time to change how we deal with large hydro dams and to make fish. And the reasons I think this is so is that there's recognition through that paper that I found in all its other work that traditional engineered fishways haven't succeeded in restoring stocks. I will say that fishway engineers are endlessly optimistic. They always think if they just tweak it a little this way or that way, their fish are going to come running up. But it hasn't worked in 3/4 of the century, and it's not going to get much better. The energy mix is rapidly changing. We have industrial scale solar and wind power coming on. We have efficiencies like smart homes. So we don't need as much hydro as we used to. We have alternatives. Also, this is really, I think, unrecognized by the public, but dams don't last forever. Dams are human-made structures that age and break. When we had those big storms last year in the Carolinas, dams broke and killed people. A lot of our dams are now middle-aged. We have to start thinking about their futures. So we should start thinking about their futures in relation to replacing that energy. And also, many dams are coming up for FERC relicensing. And FERC, when it relicenses for periods of about 40 or 50 years. So if you have mistakes, if you have a fully functioning system, you lock that in for several decades. And we're about to lock in a lot of fully functioning dams. So I think this is a very important time. And in thinking about new ideas of how to handle this, I developed this concept with Carl Lindbergh that I'll tell you about. We published a paper in the New York Times in 2014 about the Susquehanna situation, about the idea of actually taking down the Conowingo Dam and letting this river run wild. And in that op-ed piece, we mentioned the idea of replacing some of that power with solar. And that kind of clicked in our minds, and we developed the concept a lot further. We published a piece in Environment 360 last year that explored this idea. So here's a generic river that's been dammed. So you have a reservoir behind a large hydro dam. You have fish coming up to the dam, wishing to get past it. Maybe a few do, most don't. And that's what we want to work with and solve. One way you might consider doing that is capitalizing on the other kinds of energy that can be produced in this area. So if you were to breach the dam, you drain the reservoir. What that gives you, in some cases, is a lot of real estate back again that was submerged. In some cases, you wouldn't get a lot, but in many cases, you would. With that real estate, you could do some things. For one thing, you could build run-of-the-river hydro. You don't have to sacrifice the entire river to get hydropower. There's now this approach of diverting some of the water into a sluiceway of some kind and capturing some of the energy while keeping the river open for fish. So the fish would come scooting up here, and you would get some energy back that way. One great advantage to working with this area and using a drained reservoir is that you already have power lines in place because it's producing hydropower. One of the greatest costs for big energy projects is the transmission lines, but they're there already, so you can capitalize on that. So you could start with one of the river hydro, and then with this real estate, you could put in solar arrays. And in some reservoirs, you would get a lot of land to do that. You also have the potential, like they use in Japan, if you have backwaters, to create floating solar power arrays. So you get more energy back that way. Finally, because reservoirs exist in valleys and have bridge lines around them, in some cases, you likely could have wind power around the edge. So in the end, if you adopt this approach, you have a fully functioning river given back to the fish and paddlers and whoever else cares about free-flowing rivers, and you have an energy park that might give you as much or more power than you had originally, and which also gives you a resilience. It turns out that the Conowingo Dam, which is rated for about 500 plus megawatts, averages 200 something, because there isn't always a lot of water there for it. Dams to produce maximum power. But in this case, you build in resilience, because if you don't have sunlight during a day or two, you probably will have wind or some combination of these. So you might have an actually more reliable system, and one which gives you your river back. So this is a concept that I'm trying to follow now, and I'm looking for funding to advance this. I got a small amount of money, but I'd like to explore this much more fully. And I think what makes this saleable is that when you tell people these stories of these fish ponds that have been lost, they say, no, it's really sad, but I like plugging my toaster in. I like having electricity. I think the key to solving this is to maintain the power while freeing the rivers. Another model I should mention is to not do all this here, but to perhaps use the real estate in some other way, like for a park, preserve, or for sensitive development, use the proceeds to build solar arrays, let's say, closer to urban areas on landfills or whatever. So there's a number of ways you can work with this concept. So I had no idea that there was a Leopold Society here, I swear. But I selected this quote because it's so perfect, the situation. Leopold said that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And I can't think of a conservation problem that's more wrong than this one. And a friend of mine was saying that if we had large walls that block bird migrations, and birds are piling up behind the walls, society would not tolerate that. But because this happens underwater, and because it's sort of grandfathered in, because it happened a long time ago, we do tolerate it. And we need to change that. So I just want to finish up on Thoreau. As I said, Thoreau had many really fascinating observations. But just to give you a taste, he was thinking about shad and their doom, and he said, "Poor shad, where is thy redress? Still wandering the sea in thy scaly armor to inquire humbly the mouths of rivers, if man is perchance left them free to enter, armed with no sword, a mere shad armed with only innocence and a just cause. Who knows what may avail a crowbar against that dam? He was thinking dam removal just as those dams were going up. He was way ahead of his time. And in fact, in another quote, he basically said, if you guys sustain yourselves for another 3,000 years, these dams are going to fall apart and dig the rivers back again. But he knew they were basically doomed, and he urged them to keep the stiff in them and stem pull the tides without mayest meet. So they're trying. Anyway, thank you. Time for a few questions, if anybody has any questions or ideas or comments. Yes?
I thought here, like river sturgeon,
That's a little guy.
encased in plastic. It came from Indian Point number 2. During the 70s, I was a fish and wildlife senior technician
Yeah.
with the DC, and we monitored the fish stocks on our island. And I don't know if they're still happening today because they still have traveling streams, but they were killing thousands
Yeah.
of young fish,
Yeah.
especially in extremely cold weather when the water temperature got, in practice weather, got super cool and the fish couldn't swim against the current. That was for the pumps.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's still going on.
It's still going on. You know, the thought was that over time we would lose these, the worst actors of these power plants because they have this open cycle cooling that sucks a lot of the water out. But because we needed more energy in the Hudson Valley, we're keeping them going longer than they were originally ordained for. But they are going to age out at some point, and I'm pretty sure that any new power
And
plants...
that's only one power plant in the river.
But they kill vast numbers of fish. They're killing them mostly as they train them into the guts of the plants. They basically cook them. And the numbers are staggering. They've done monitoring studies that show that across the entire system, you're looking at billions of eggs in market. It doesn't mean you're losing a billion adult fish, because there's gas mortality anyway in those life stages, but it's certainly causing harm to these populations.
And as a commercial fisherman, it's a sort of anecdotal, but I noticed that even though the river chemically was cleaner, that the fish population still went down. One of the factors that shows on a graph the number of fish landed has a lot to do with the fact that the commercial fishermen were dying up their old counters, and the commercial effort got smaller and smaller over the years.
Sure. But since then, there's very good evidence that some species are doing better because different mussels have made the water clearer. They've made the light penetrate further into the water column, which makes the weed beds more extensive. So weed bed type species like carp and sunfish are doing better. Fish that rely on the pelagic food chain up in the water column, like striped bass and shad larvae, are doing worse. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer for fish populations. There's always going to be some
There was
up and down.
a commercial netting of striped bass along the coast. The striped bass population came up and entered the river to spawn, and we had a tremendous increase in sport fishing and the striped bass.
Yeah, the striped bass population in the Hudson is doing pretty well, though I think there are some things that are still keeping it a little bit limited. Other question? Back there?
When you mentioned the dams here in the Hudson River watershed and that many of them were not really being used anymore, what would be like the main issue as far as taking them down? Money, cooperation?
We don't have a... in other states, there are whole offices full of people, like in Connecticut or Massachusetts, that only do this. In your state, DEC, which does some very nice work on many subjects, hasn't devoted itself to this subject in a major way. It's always been like one item among various issues in the Habitats Office. We need a number of individuals that are devoted to this alone. It's a big job. And then they have to work closely with the grassroots people from location to location. CF was so good at this, the head of this kind of work in Connecticut, he's so great that in my book I said we should clone him and give one to him to each state. Believes that the agencies can't do it without the people can't do it without the agencies. We haven't developed this nexus between these two worlds here. So there's a lot of interest in the subject. There was a conference last year in Albany about fish passage and tributary restoration in the Hudson River, and it drew a huge crowd. But nothing happened since then because there's no organization, there's no entity that knows how to run with this. So this is the big frustration in the Hudson, is that it's not happening because we don't have the proper structure to make it happen. But the potential is huge. And I think the potential is huge in two ways. One is that there's a lot of dams that can be taken down. The second is that these alewives, which is the major species we're trying to restore in these rivers, are happy to spawn in ponds behind dams. And in fact, they like to run up rivers to lakes to spawn. If we're not going to take the dam down, we should at least put up a fishway, because fishways work well with alewives. Unlike the shad, which is a big ocean fish that doesn't like these little passageways, alewives spawn in little brooks where they kind of jump from little pocket to pocket. So a fishway is not that different for an alewife. So we should be doing one of two things in every little system, either taking the dam down or building a fishway. Up to now, we haven't done either. We got to get going. Yes?
What is the process? How is a dam taken down?
Okay, generally, there's a whole lead-in process where you have to find funding and then have institutional buy-in. So you have to have the government of that particular town buy in, you have to have the agencies buy in, and eventually when you have enough, when you've gone through all those legal loopholes, you essentially divert the river to one side, so you have access to the dam without there being a lot of water funding behind it, and then you just sort of break it apart in some fashion. It could be with explosives, it could be with some kind of a heavy machinery, and it comes down, and actually it's interesting how quickly these systems heal themselves. When I was writing the book, I toured some systems in Massachusetts and Connecticut that had been had dam removals in the last couple of years, and these engineers said, "Tell me what the dam was." I couldn't figure it out because they heal themselves so fast. So a river, wants to be a river again, and you see tremendous restoration once you give it a chance to heal itself. Yes.
Is there any worry maybe to reintroducing the fish that it's been gone for like over 150 years, and maybe the river has, learned to the system without it? Is there any worry?
I'm not worried. I think they belong there. Sure, you might have a differently functioning ecosystem now, but there's no reason to believe it's more desirable from a human point of view or better in any fashion. They were there. I don't see any reason not to bring them back. One concern is that sometimes if you took dams down, you might allow some non-native species to get to places where they haven't been yet. But I think that's a fair trade-off to bring back what belongs. Yes?
Could you comment on the explosion of seals in Nantucket and the Martha's Vineyard area and striped bass?
Well, the striped bass are doing well, and they are flourishing off Cape Cod. They come from the Chesapeake and the Hudson mainly, and spend the summers there. The seals are eating the striped bass and anything else they could get their mouths around. The seals have expanded their range southward. Nowadays, most populations of everything are going northward because of climate change. But seals were already north, but as their populations expanded because of protections, they're moving south. So we're seeing seals in the Hudson River much more frequently than we ever did, Long Island Sound. It's mostly population abundance. When populations of anything get larger, there's more competition among individuals, and they tend to expand their ranges. So I think that pretty much what's going on with seals.
Do you think it's going to have on the striped bass?
No, I mean seals have always eaten striped bass, and they're allowed a meal. I don't think they're going to cause any major harm. There are much bigger issues with striped bass than seals. It's part of their normal ecology. Back there.
In one of the earlier slides of the, I think it was a wooden fish ladder that had very narrow openings, is there any possibility they can just widen those openings?
No, but then it changes the engineering aspects of the water flow, and you get a straight torrent. You have to stop it enough where there's a pocket of calm water and then a little opening of fast water. So the fish basically works its way up. It kind of like gathers strength, shoots through the fast water, rests in the calm water. If you just had a fast flowing chute, it would be impossible to go up against.
So I'm going to thank John. I think we could go on with questions for a long time, but thank you